Hey guys, Zane here with another one-take review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Lykke Li album, Eyeye. Eyeye is the latest album from singer-slash-songwriter Lykke Li, as well as her first album since 2018's So Sad, So Sexy, which was easily one of the best album titles of 2018, but definitely not one of the most well-received of the year, even if it wasn't totally hated by most places either. That being said, the lukewarm reception from major publications like Pitchfork and Rolling Stone, as well as a solid but relatively unremarkable Metacritic score average, meant that Lykke Li's follow up to that record had to be impressive in some regard, and unfortunately, it just really isn't. Lykke Li is strong of a vocalist as ever here, as the voice that made albums like Wounded Rhymes such standouts within the alternative pop music scene is back here to deliver more haunting sounds. Lee has always felt like a bit of a wandering spirit of a vocalist, as her very cold but still sort of shrouded in mystery delivery mixed with a generally although she does remain an interesting individual here, I do feel like vocally she fails to shine as much as she has on previous efforts. Although her entire sound is admittedly based around minimalism, it still does feel like Eyeye relies too much on too little of a performance from the artist in question. While Lee's vocal style is admittedly pleasant to listen to, it still feels like her very subtle and low-key delivery on the record just doesn't amount to much or fail to achieve anything in the grand scheme of Eyeye as a record, when really this album could have been boosted in terms of quality majorly if she just felt a little more present. Lykke Li's lyricism is pretty strong here for the most part as well, though it definitely isn't her best work by any means. Previous albums like the aforementioned Wounded Rhymes and I Never Learn had very reflective, heartbroken tones to them that defined Lykke Li as a performer and made her the big name within the realm of alternative music that she is today. In recent interviews within the past few years, Lee has talked about slowly moving her music and her overall lyrical style in a progressively more current direction, and that is definitely something that translates to her latest record, as many of the emotionally crippling passages here definitely still feel grounded in a more current setting, rather than reflecting directly on the past like some of her past efforts have. Now, I do have to say that this potential change in perspective initially sounds very promising on paper as a slight change within Lee's music, while not totally straying from what has made her such a definitive sound. The way that she fails to translate her desperate melancholy and emotional struggles from her previous era to a newer refresh of her lyrical style and overall musical sound is, in turn, frankly disappointing. The compositional work here certainly doesn't do the lyricism any favors either, as it tends to be extremely unremarkable with a misty and or aquatic layering over it that just feels unneeded and doesn't seem to work as well as it should. Rather than being shrouded in uncertainty and mystery, Eyeye is Lykke Li's traditional sound and instrumentation taken down to its dullest moments. That isn't to say that the instrumentals are bad by any means, they certainly aren't. I mean, they suit Lee's vocals well enough, and they do their job well enough as well, just sort of progressing the album along with no particularly noteworthy bumps along the way. They do drag the album down to a slight extent, however, as it's another example of a factor of Lykke Li's music that she has worked with in an extraordinary manner in the past, just being sort of dumbed down or sort of watered down, I guess you could say, to its least interesting and most predictable extent. In this case, it's her atmosphere-focused backing instrumentals. This all leads to the record being a downright boring listen at times. There isn't a moment on the album that's genuinely bad. In fact, most of it's actually pretty enjoyable and pleasant overall, but the atmosphere that it attempts to go for is just too weak to not blend into the world around the listener. Lykke Li does her absolute best here to be atmospherically overwhelming in her voice and heartbroken lyrics, but unfortunately, the atmosphere provided by the real world ends up overtaking her more times than it doesn't. This leaves her being basically relegated to background music, as there's nothing done here that's new beyond Lee going back to her atmospheric and dreamy ambient roots after the change in sound that was So Sad, So Sexy. Unfortunately, this does result in a listen that feels more like a cheap attempt to recapture former glory than it does to actually push forward artistically. Li did say in an interview that this record was meant to be the last heartbroken record of hers, as sort of a full circle record, I guess you could say, sort of closing off a full circle of starting out as a very heartbroken singer songwriter and doing one last album as a very heartbroken singer songwriter. But frankly, this is kind of a weak closer if it's supposed to be the end of this era of Lykke Li. It's just not impressive in any particular manner. Overall, Eyeye could have been so much more in the end. The idea of Lykke Li returning to an older sound of hers while maintaining a sense of maturity that she's developed over the past few years as an artist sounds excellent on paper, but it ultimately results in an unremarkable and uninteresting album that really has no replay value and even less reason to exist in the first place. And I really just think this may very well be the weakest Lykke Li album yet, and it doesn't really serve any particular place in her discography and adds nothing to her overall sound, style, or prominence as an artist, which is why I'm going to give this record, although it is pleasant, 3 stars out of 5. There's just nothing interesting done here, and even after having listened to this for the sake of review and really analyzing it as deep as I possibly can, I've come up with nothing really to make me want to listen to this again outside of reviewing it. There's just not much here to know, there's not much here to hear. It's just a nothing album almost. And that's a shame because Lykke Li is truly one of the more talented artists within the alternative pop scene right now. But this one isn't a home run, unfortunately. So yeah, 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.